Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome you to celebrate the bicentenary of the death of the Napoleon Emperor. And this event is organized by the Alliance Française USA network, as well as the French services, cultural services of the French Embassy. My name is Marguerite Bickel, and I'm the national coordinator for the Alliance Française network here in the USA. This event is also organized in partnership with the Federation of the Alliance Française USA. And I am very pleased tonight to welcome our guest, which is Thomas Crocker, for this conference about his latest book, Empire Eagles, The Fate of Napoleonic Elites in America, published this year by Prometheus Book. So please remain muted, and we will have a very long Q&A session at the end of Thomas' presentation. So, Thomas, they are all yours.
Thank you very much, Marguerite. It's a real privilege and pleasure both to be speaking to the Alliance Française this evening. This story begins at sunset on Sunday, June 18th, 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte is in desperate flight from the battlefield at Waterloo. The Prussians and the English are hard at his heels. Racing to reach Paris, he abandons on the road his bulletproof coach and imperial nécessaire containing a fortune in precious gems and cash. Will he stand and fight again or flee to the United States? Reaching Paris early in the morning of the summer solstice, the mud-splattered Napoleon stops to languish in his bath at the Élysée Palace while reading Alexander von Humboldt's diaries of his travels in America. He dispatches his younger brother Lucien to plead with the Parliament to authorize him to reunite with Marshal Emmanuel Grouchy's intact cavalry corps and fight one more time. But he is too late. The Marquis de Lafayette and secret police chief Joseph-René have established an interim government. They have had enough. Napoleon abdicates the following day and resumes his flight. There is no question where he's going. As early as 1812, he and his older brother Joseph Bonaparte, the King of Spain, had selected New Jersey as their bolt hole. Napoleon envisions a new role for himself in America as a scholar and a savant, surrounded by his family and devoting himself to his avocations of geography, science, and mathematics. Before he resumes his flight, Napoleon orders proactive measures. He directs the imperial treasurer to transfer 3 million francs in gold to the United States. He orders his aides to organize transportation to America of most of the imperial library, as well as sufficient china, linens, and furniture from Malmaison to furnish both a large townhouse and a country estate. He packs 20 hunting guns and orders his groom with 15 stable boys, horses, saddles, and equipment to sail for America. His aides even take out subscriptions for various Parisian newspapers to be delivered to Napoleon, care of General Delivery, New York. The immediate and pressing question is how to get to the United States. Napoleon orders 2 French naval vessels placed at his disposal and requests that secret police chief Fouché issue passports. Fouché demurs and passes the request to the Duke of Wellington, thereby tipping the British office to Napoleon's plans, but all the while conveying to Napoleon that their issuance is imminent. Napoleon and his entourage flee southward toward the Atlantic port of Rochefort as the Prussian and British dragnet closes in. Events later show that the 2 French naval vessels ordered by Napoleon are under secret orders from Fouché never to carry him to America. When Napoleon belatedly begins to realize this, he has to come up with the proverbial plan B. The British are closely patrolling the coast in the huge ship of the line, Bellerophon, affectionately known to her men as the Billy Ruffian, to try to catch Napoleon. As one British sailor puts it, nothing could escape our Argus eyes, eagerly looking in every rat hole for Napoleon le Grand. Napoleon therefore opened secret discussions for Plan B, to escape on the French naval corvette Bayadère, which lies at anchor excuse me, I have my slideshow is not progressing. Bum, bum, bum. There. Anyway, Napoleon therefore opened secret discussions for Plan B to escape on the French naval corvette Bayadere, which lies at anchor near Bordeaux. The captain of the Bayadere, Charles Baudin, whom you see here, is a one-armed Huguenot who later goes on to a distinguished career as an admiral. Intoxicated by Napoleon, he is more than willing to help, even though he judges his corvette to be no match for the Bellerophon. He joins with the local military commander and the ardently Bonapartist U.S. consul at Bordeaux, William Lee, to devise a plan to sacrifice the Bayadere in an engagement against the Bellerophon, while Napoleon and a few key aides slip out on a Baltimore ship, the Pike, which lies at anchor in Bordeaux harbor. Now, the Pike is not an ordinary U.S. merchantman. She is a heavily armed U.S. privateer, just freed up from service in the War of 1812. She is present at Bordeaux under very suspicious circumstances for use by Bonapartist sympathizers against the British and apparently operating under the control of U.S. Consul William Lee. Baltimore privateers like the Pike were renowned for their speed. With their raked masts and ample sails, these so-called Baltimore flyers used the wind more efficiently than other ships. Handled properly, they cruised at speeds of 11 or 12 knots versus 5 or 6 for ordinary warships. On the rare occasions that the British captured them during the War of 1812, they proved virtually useless because only their specialized Baltimore crews knew how to handle them. But back to the Baudin-Lee plan to save the emperor. Napoleon approves it and instructs Captain Baudin to await further instructions. Those instructions come a few days later when Napoleon sends his trusted right-hand man, Lieutenant General Charles Baron Lallemand, who is deputy commander of the Imperial Guard Light Cavalry at Waterloo, on a secret nighttime mission to Bordeaux. Lallemand is a singular character, high energy, creative, and as Napoleon said of him, possessed of the sacred fire. Meeting with Baudin Lee in Bordeaux at 2 o'clock in the morning, Lallemand and his co-conspirators activate the plan. They order the Pike and Bayadere, accompanied by another U.S. privateer, the Ludlow, to break free of the British blockade and stand by to receive Napoleon and his aides off the coast by the port of Royan. The ships proceed and are waiting. Now, meanwhile, Lallemand returns to Napoleon at Rochefort and in a critical council of war argues adamantly for Napoleon to board the Pike forthwith. However, by this time, Napoleon is engaged through proxies in parallel negotiations with the captain of the Bellerophon to surrender to the British, thinking he could buy a country estate outside London and lead a life of leisure. Despite evidence that the British have a spy in Napoleon's entourage, the British remain clueless about the plan involving the Pike. As Napoleon prepares to make an imminent decision, an unexpected factor intervenes. Royalist forces seize territory around Royan. To escape, Napoleon must travel to the port incognito and in disguise. This, the ever-proud emperor views as beneath his dignity. In literally the last hour, he scotches the American escape plan for the British option to his everlasting regret. Several observations. First, if Napoleon had sought to escape on the Pike, his chances of success would have been significant. If Captain Baudin's Bayadere had run interference as planned, the ultra-fast Pike likely would not have been caught. Second, the U.S. consul in Bordeaux, William Lee, was a dangerous freelancer. He knew full well the British intent to stop Napoleon, but he nonetheless took affirmative actions to facilitate his departure for the United States. Actions which could have resulted in a hostile naval engagement with the Royal Navy and the loss of life. Had this occurred, the negative effect on U.S. relations with Great Britain, with which the United States had just months earlier concluded peace, would have been significant and possibly long-lived. Moreover, it would have violated the Madison administration's policy of strict neutrality in the war between Britain and France. And it also could have poisoned relations with the new Bourbon government in France. Lee's actions were foolhardy. Third, this story illustrates the latitude and discretion with which diplomats worked in the early 19th century, when communications were not as they are now. Today, the decision would have been made in Washington, most likely by the White House, not even the State Department, and communicated instantly for the in-country diplomats to execute. Diplomacy in the 19th century put a premium on the intelligence, character, and wisdom of the man on the scene. Unfortunately, Lee lacked all three. However, Empire's Eagles involves much more than Napoleon. In the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, a veritable exodus of marshals, generals, and regime insiders made their way to the United States. Spurred by prescription lists drawn up by Fouché, many came under aliases and on the lam. The list reads like a who's who of the top echelon of the leadership during Napoleon's 100 days. Indeed, never before had so much of a nation's military or political class migrated to the United States. Napoleon himself estimated that over 300 high-ranking Bonapartist military men fled to America. Some estimates run as high as 30,000 when taking into account their families and entourages as well as economic refugees. To a remarkable degree, their destination was one city, Philadelphia, which soon became known for its glittering recreation of Parisian glamour. They were aided in this choice by three factors. First was Quaker Philadelphia's reputation as the United States' second largest and most sophisticated and tolerant city. Second was the residence in Philadelphia of one of the wealthiest men in America, the French-born Stephen Girard, who not only financed the War of 1812, but also helped provide a safe haven for his fellow countrymen. Third was the presence in Philadelphia of a colony of white French-speaking Dominicans who had fled the slave revolt of 1791 in what is now Haiti. Mostly shopkeepers and artisans, they had little in common with the formerly powerful and cosmopolitan newcomers. But they nonetheless provided an established Francophone community onto which the newcomers could graft themselves. Chief among the new refugees was Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, the King of Spain. Because of his strong resemblance to Napoleon, he offered to substitute himself for his brother in order to facilitate his escape, but Napoleon declined. Then, following his own hair-raising incognito escape from France to America, during which Joseph left his wife and daughters behind, he first lived in a townhouse near Washington Square in Philadelphia, which still stands. But Joseph preferred life in the country, and he purchased an estate called Point Breeze, perched high on a bluff near Bordentown across the Delaware River from Philadelphia. He lived there for most of the rest of his long life. The mansion was quite spectacular. A visitor allowed into his private apartments provides a peek. The curtains and canopy and furniture were of light blue satin trimmed with silver. Every room contained a mirror reaching from the ceiling to the floor. Over the bed hung a splendid mirror and also one over the table. The walls were covered with oil paintings, principally of young females with less clothing about them than they or you would have found comfortable in our cold climate. In every room of the house, there were statues of Napoleon in different positions. Now, in a secret cabinet in the study, Joseph kept a collection of jewels, including the crown and the rings that he wore as King of Spain. The public rooms contained a gallery with a notable collection of paintings by masters, which reportedly included works by Rembrandt, Titian, Raphael, Rubens, and Da Vinci. On one wall hung a full-scale copy of David's dramatic Passage of the Alps, showing Napoleon on rearing horse and with cape flowing. In a sharp departure from formal French and indeed European and American garden design at the time, Joseph developed the grounds as a carefully planned, naturalized wilderness or picturesque landscaping, complete with bridle paths, secret bowers, and an artificial lake with swans. He based the concept on his chateau in the Picardy region of northern France. The result was little short of revolutionary in terms of garden design in America, and in fact, it influenced Frederick Law Olmsted's design of Central Park. The property was riddled with mysterious brick tunnels, supposedly for quick escape from assassins. Unfortunately, the Point Breeze mansion no longer stands, but remains of the tunnels do, and there's one on the slide now. While living at Point Breeze, Joseph took an American Quaker, Annette Savage, as his mistress. By her, he had 2 daughters and descendants alive in America today. Point Breeze, moreover, became a salon for the exiled Bonapartists. Joseph was far from a recluse. People came to him. He was popular with his neighbors, who called him the good Mr. Bonaparte. Visitors from Philadelphia arrived at Point Breeze by a 16-oar barge that Stephen Girard gave him. They included many exiled French officers. There they drank deeply of their memories of the past and plotted while Joseph merely listened. Although they tried to recruit him to their plots, he scrupulously declined. He became a staunch admirer of George Washington and American democracy, and even went on a pilgrimage to Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon to pay homage to the first president. Another prominent refugee was Marshal Emmanuel, Marquis de Grouchy, the aristocratic commander of the Cavalry Reserve Corps at Waterloo, who, under a death sentence, also settled in Philadelphia with his two sons. So too did the just mentioned General Charles Lallemand of the Sacred Fire. Following Waterloo, Lallemand made his way to America in disguise after being imprisoned by the British on Malta and wandering through the Middle East. He joined his younger brother Henri, also a cavalry general, who was already here. Other prominent generals included Napoleon's former aide-de-camp, General Charles Count Lefebvre-Desnouettes, who, as Lallemand's immediate superior, commanded the light cavalry division of the Old Guard at Waterloo, and the rough and pillaging General Dominique Count Vandamme, the division commander of the Third Corps at Waterloo. So bad was his reputation that Napoleon once said that if he had two Vandammes, he would have to order one to hang the other. The list goes on and on. These were men who had spent their entire adult lives fighting all over Europe. They knew no other trade. Not surprisingly, they soon got into trouble. The trouble focused on two utopian schemes. In the first scheme, the Bonapartist refugees in Philadelphia lobbied the Madison administration and Congress to make a concessional land grant in newly captured Creek Indian territory on the Tombigbee River in Alabama for a colony to grow, of all things, wine and olives. The idea seems to have first been floated by U.S. Consul William Lee, who was back in the United States after having been forced out of his post at Bordeaux. Known as the Society for the Cultivation of the Vine and Olive, Lee was its vice president and chief lobbyist before being hired by Madison to redecorate the burnt-out White House. The idea was quickly picked up by the French-language newspaper in Philadelphia, Le Bee Américain, or the American Bee, and attracted the interest of many of the Napoleonic emigres. Lee's efforts succeeded, and Madison signed the grant into law on his last day in office. It was a boondoggle by any measure. Over 90,000 acres granted at concessional rates. Nonetheless, French settlers moved to Alabama and started the back-breaking work of clearing the land and planting the crops. Needless to say, it was not a success. Lost in the shuffle was the fact that certain prominent Bonapartists in Philadelphia never went to Alabama. Instead, they pledged their claims to bankers in that city for significant ready cash loans. Chief among these was Charles Lallemand. And what was Lallemand going to do with that ready cash? The answer, in short, was to invade Texas in a scheme to place Joseph Bonaparte on the throne of Mexico, notwithstanding Joseph's refusal to go along with it. On his very first day in office as Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams received an intercepted package of letters written by a prominent Bonapartist emigre. The letters sought support for a secret French military expedition to enter Texas and set up a mini-state which would work in collaboration with disaffected elements within Mexico proper. Given the delicate state of Spanish America at the time, this was the approximate equivalent of being handed a sizzling stick of dynamite. Now, guess who showed up in Adams's office the very first day to help? You've got it, former U.S. Consul William Lee. Adams dispatched the ubiquitous Lee to ascertain the intentions of Lallemand and to warn him off any precipitous action. The matter quickly escalated into a major diplomatic row between Adams and the French, British, and Spanish ministers in Washington, as the nervous Adams suspected complicity of one or more of them in the plot. The matter boiled for some months as Adams fretted about it in his personal diary. At length, the indispensable William Lee reported to Adams. He had met with Lallemand, who denied the plot. Lallemand, of course, was disingenuous. The expedition was already underway. Several hundred former French soldiers arrived in Galveston, where they fell in with the pirate Jean Lafitte and waited for reinforcements. The Bonapartists and the pirates quickly formed a mutual admiration society. Eventually, with aid from Lafitte and some 400 to 600 strong, with only a handful of women and children, they pushed off into the interior of Texas, where they set up a military camp that they christened the Champ d'Asile, or Field of Asylum, which you see here. It was a curious place. From the start, the camp was run as a military operation. The approximately 100 officers were organized into 3 companies of infantry, foot cavalry, and artillery. After completion of the fortifications, regular military drills occupied several hours each day on an improvised parade ground. An oversized tricolor hung from a large tree at the center of the encampment. They evidently didn't have a flagpole. And each night, watch was mounted around the camp. The old soldiers would sit by the central bonfire, grandly called the Palais Royal, and discuss their campaigns. Less happily, desertions and duels began to proliferate, and Lallemand resorted to placing sentries around the perimeter of the camp with orders to shoot any deserters. But the ultimate purpose of the colony remained vague. Its attempts at agriculture were perfunctory, a few melons and a dream of cultivating tobacco. Lallemand offered his services to Spain, thus confirming Adams's suspicions, but the viceroy declined his offer, thereby refuting those suspicions. There was, inconsistently, talk of aiding Mexican insurgents and throwing off the Spanish government in exchange for a fast ship to liberate Napoleon from St. Helena. Lallemand authored a manifesto that articulated the philosophical underpinnings of the Champ d'Asile, where the plight of the exiled soldiers mourning the loss of their country struck a nostalgic chord. A subscription was opened up to support the colony. It gathered close to 100,000 francs, none of which ever reached the Champ d'Asile. A song was composed in the colony's honor, which became popular in the Parisian cafes, and various artists churned out idealized paintings and lithographs of the little corner of France in the wilds of Texas, such as the one shown here. I love the palm tree with the sign saying Place Marengo. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground grew increasingly dire. The Spanish authorities in San Antonio determined to oust the demoralized Frenchmen. They sent an expeditionary force which surrounded the Champ d'Asile. Without a shot being fired, the French capitulated, broke camp, and returned to Galveston, where they lived in destitution along the beach before dispersing. The Society of the Vine and Olive and the Champ d'Asile were both utopian experiments gone wrong. Elements of them were high-minded. In their published propaganda, their founders held them up as an exercise in the civic virtues of antiquity. The examples of Cincinnatus returning to the plow and of George Washington, as well as of Spartans and Thebans, figured in their philosophical musings. So also did elements of Rousseau's social contract. Both sets of colonists consciously chose not to live as noble savages by hunting and fishing. In this, they contrasted sharply with their French-Canadian cousins, the Coureurs de Bois, who attained a highly adaptive and, one might argue, more successful lifestyle by doing precisely that. However, in both cases, the utopias represented an image of America seen by European and more particularly French eyes. And in the case of the Champ d'Asile, that image became blurred and haunted by the Napoleonic epic. In their military routines and campfire reminiscences, the soldiers were no longer following Cincinnatus as a model, but were little more than homesick demi-soul trying to recapture their past glory. Both utopias encapsulated a static ideal of small landholders happily tilling their plots within a supportive, localized community, a concept as Jeffersonian as it was Jacobin. The static ideal was singular in its impracticality and lack of knowledge of the context in which it was being attempted. What the ideal failed and failed utterly to take account of was nature in America, nature in the form of geography, distances, climate, weather, crops. It also failed to take account of human nature, greed, boredom, loneliness, despair. The combination proved fatal. With the collapse of the Champ d'Asile, General Charles Lallemand settled in New Orleans. He became a U.S. citizen and purchased various properties and slaves on credit, on which he defaulted. He wound up in London, where in 1825 he became an agent for the insurgent Greek government, which wanted to purchase warships to fight against Ottoman rule. He returned to the United States and negotiated for the construction of 2 frigates. There were cost overruns and allegations that Lallemand absconded with thousands of dollars. However, with the 1830 revolution in France that placed Louis-Philippe on the throne, Lallemand's fortunes turned. He could now safely return to France. Before he left America, Joseph Bonaparte entrusted Lallemand with a letter making the case for Napoleon's son to succeed to the throne of France, along with thousands of dollars to support the project. Lallemand turned the letter over to Louis-Philippe, who told him to burn it because he could do nothing to help the Bonapartes. In the process, the thousands of dollars that Joseph had entrusted to Lallemand for the project allegedly disappeared. The remainder of Lallemand's career, however, proved felicitous. He became governor of Corsica and inspector general of the military academy at Saint-Cyr. He died a peer of France in 1839. Certainly, Napoleon's judgment that Lallemand possessed the sacred fire was not wide of the mark. He was an energetic and creative officer who pushed the boundaries and who probably would have saved Napoleon from St. Helena if he had only listened to him. But his actions in America showed another aspect to his character. He hijacked the Society of the Vine and Olive to help pay for the Champ d'Asile. He operated in great secrecy. He repeatedly failed to account for funds entrusted to him, and he cynically manipulated both US and French media to inflate the strength and success of the Champ d'Asile, probably in order to increase its attractiveness to the highest bidder, be that the United States, Imperial Spain, or the Mexican insurgents. That he was a world-class adventurer, few would deny. Now, to turn to the 200-year-old mystery surrounding Michel Ney, the Duke of Elchingen, Prince of Moscow, Marshal of France, and the bravest of the brave. The question is this: was Marshal Ney executed by a firing squad on December 7, 1815, and buried in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris? Or was the execution staged, and did Ney in fact join the other Napoleonic refugees by escaping France to live as an obscure school teacher named Peter Stewart Ney in the rural south of the United States? First, a few words of background on Marshal Ney. He was an ethnic German born in Sarre-Louis, France in 1769, which is the same year as Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington. Sarre-Louis was then in France, but now is in Germany. He was from a modest background, but received a good local education and apprenticed to become a notary before enlisting as a private in the French Hussars at age 19. Following the French Revolution, the officer ranks were open to commoners, and Ney's rise through the enlisted and later officer ranks was meteoric. He was a superb horseman and swordsman and a born leader. He was known as the Rougeaud, or the Redhead. His campaigns throughout the 1790s were mainly in and around the Rhine. At this stage, he was not in Napoleon's orbit. He was first promoted to brigadier general in 1796 at age 27. He declined the promotion because he did not think he deserved it, as he did subsequent promotions, only to be overridden by the government and ordered to accept them. In a career that lasted 27 years, he fought in literally hundreds of engagements and battles and was wounded multiple times, sometimes severely. He was a soldier's soldier, a man of the field, not a political general. Ney first met Napoleon in 1801 when Bonaparte summoned him to Paris because of his nascent reputation. Ney had never before visited Paris. Bonaparte was lavish in his praise. He maneuvered to attach Ney to his person and fortunes. He even enlisted the aid of the Empress Josephine. She introduced the young hero to the woman who had become his wife, the dark-haired beauty, Aglaé Louise Auguié, who is a close friend of Josephine's daughter Hortense, and subsequently a lady-in-waiting to the Empress. When they married in 1802, Ney was a battle-hardened 32, and his courtly bride was barely 20. It was very much a love match. Ney was devoted to her, and together they had a total of 4 sons, 3 of which you see here. Scores of battles ensued, in which Ney distinguished himself, earning Napoleon's sobriquet of the bravest of the brave and his elevation to the Marshalate in 1804. His crowning achievement, however, came in his command of the retreat from Moscow in 1812, in which he literally saved the Grande Armée, or what was left of it. It was a harrowing, indeed heroic tale told in the book. To fully appreciate the scope of this disaster, I draw your attention to the famous 1869 map and statistical graphic depicting Napoleon's invasion of Russia prepared by Charles Joseph Minard, which shows the routes of the invasion and the retreat and the dwindling size of the French forces. The red going out towards Moscow, of course, diminishing in the black on the retreat. Ney went on to play a critical role in Napoleon's first abdication, for which Napoleon never forgave him. Ney swore allegiance to the newly restored Louis XVIII when Napoleon went into exile on Elba. When Napoleon landed in France for the 100 Days, Ney famously promised Louis that he would bring Napoleon to him in an iron cage. Instead, Ney flipped and with his troops joined Napoleon. Still not fully trusting Ney, however, Napoleon held him at arm's length until Waterloo. Then he summoned him. Ney was in effect the field commander of all the French forces at Waterloo and personally led the final charges of the Old Guard against the British squares. He fled after the battle, fully intending to seek refuge in the United States. Instead, he was arrested, tried by the Chamber of Peers, which was the upper house of Parliament, sentenced to death, and executed on the Rue d'Enfer, or Hell Street, in Paris on December 7, 1815. Or was he? Rumors started circulating the very day of the execution that Ney had not really been killed, that the firing squad was composed of his old soldiers, that the execution was faked, and that Napoleon had escaped. Using secret police reports, diaries, and other records, many never published in English before, Empire's Eagles uncovers multiple active plots to free Ney during his imprisonment and trial, as well as a host of irregularities surrounding the execution, the firing squad and bullets, the handling of the body within the nearby Maternity Hospital to which it was taken, and the mysterious circumstances of his burial in the dark and in a double coffin. So there we have the short story of Marshal Ney. Against this background, Empire's Eagles examines analytically the complex evidence of whether a school teacher who called himself Peter Stewart Ney was in fact Marshal Ney. Peter Stewart Ney was a man of great mystery. He appeared out of nowhere, but left a profound impression on almost everyone he encountered. He first appeared in South Carolina in the fall of 1819 and established a sterling reputation as a somewhat itinerant schoolmaster to the children of the local gentry for the next 27 years. Although this was an age before photography, he bore a strong resemblance to Marshal Ney in terms of hair and eye coloration, height, build, age, and personality. He was immediately suspected of being Marshal Ney because of this resemblance and because of his many war wounds, martial bearing, horsemanship, and swordsmanship, as well as his undefined foreign accent. All agreed he was highly intelligent, well-educated, and intimidating. French soldiers who fought under Ney visiting the United States saw and approached him, thinking he was the marshal, but he always backed away. Many, but not all of his students and their parents thought he was Marshal Ney, a fact that he did not deny when occasionally in his cups. He was an ardent Bonapartist, highly secretive, had intimate knowledge of Napoleonic battles and of Marshal Ney's family, and had many character traits and habits that matched those of Marshal Ney. To cite but one, they both played the flute. When asked by his attending doctor on his deathbed, just hours before he died, who he really was, he replied that he was indeed Marshal Ney of France. The matter remained one of local lore and legend until it began to be picked up by newspapers nationally about 10 years after his death. Empire's Eagles takes a fresh look at all the evidence with an open mind and in light of modern databases, internet sources, and other means. The methodology of the book is simple. The Peter Stewart Ney story collapses if it can be proven that 1, Marshal Ney in fact was executed on December 7, 1815. 2, because of differences between Marshal Ney and Peter Stewart Ney, they could not have been identical. Or 3, there is evidence that Peter Stewart Ney had an identity other than that of Marshal Ney before coming to America. Not wanting to spoil a good mystery, I will only say that the book examines the execution and its immediate aftermath in great detail, looking at the plots to free Ney, the people who had access to Ney during his imprisonment and trial, the composition of the firing squad, the damage done by the bullets, or lack thereof, and the manifests of various ships on which he was alleged to have escaped, among many other factors. Looking at the second prong of the analysis, whether there were differences between the two men so they could not have been identical, The book examines a host of indicia, including the startling fact that at least 5 wounds on the body of Peter Stewart Ney exactly matched 5 known to have been borne by Marshal Ney. Think about that for a moment. There were many resemblances, but this area is complex and nuanced, and there is indeed some problematic evidence. However, you will simply have to read Empire's Eagles to explore this mystery. Finally, the book examines the third prong of the analysis, whether there is evidence that Peter Stewart Ney had an identity other than Marshal Ney before coming to America. In other words, if he were not Marshal Ney, then who was he? Was he French? Was he German? Was he British or Scottish? Did he fight for Napoleon? Or did he even fight for Wellington? This hypothetical is probably the most fascinating mystery of all. The book examines various possibilities, but discards them all. At the end of the day, Peter Stewart Ney remains a mystery. He once described himself as an atom floating on the atmosphere of chance. His story is a poignant one of human tragedy, an emigre warrior who washed up on the shores of America in the wake of Waterloo, but who very much wanted to return to his wife and sons in France, and yet at the same time to be lost to the world. I want to close by saying you've seen a number of paintings of people this evening. It is rare indeed to see a photograph to look into the actual face of an officer who fought under Marshal Ney at Waterloo. Here is a daguerreotype of Colonel John Jacob Lehmanowsky of the 9th Polish Lancers. Note the saber scar on his cheek. He too fled to America after Waterloo. He settled in Indiana and became a Lutheran minister and lecturer on the Napoleonic Wars. In the early 1840s, he spent a day and a night talking with Peter Stewart Ney. And yes, he was certain he was Marshal Ney. However, you be the judge. Empire's Eagles, the fate of the Napoleonic elite in America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I see that there is one question already in the chat, and that is, where was the Champ d'Asile located?
Where was, I'm sorry, the what located?
Champ d'Asile.
It's in Texas, yeah. They've never found it. It's on the Trinity River in Texas, north of Galveston, but they've searched for it, but they've never actually located it.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, so now it's time to ask all your questions about this fascinating presentation and all its mysteries. So you can unmute yourself or ask your questions in the chat.
Yeah, let me stop sharing and I'll come back in. Okay, so there we are.
Mr. Crocker, I have a question for you. It began with something you said in the first 30 seconds of this talk. What happened to the gold that Napoleon transferred to the U.S.?
That's a very good question. I don't know what happened to the gold. He had a set of banking relations, which I did try to trace. He and his brother Joseph both used the same bankers, and I did find a lot of evidence of Joseph Bonaparte selling his jewels from Spain to finance his art collection and other lifestyle to which he became accustomed in the United States. The short answer is I don't know what happened to the gold. The ship with the grooms and the horses and all of that returned and went back to France. But the gold, good question. Don't know.
Tom, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. Full disclosure, Tom and I are cousins, but I'm speaking absolutely sincerely and without bias. I thought it was fascinating. It's a wonderful book. I live in Maine, and as a kid growing up, we all learned that Marie Antoinette was going to escape the revolution and come to Maine. Any evidence that Bonaparte was aware of that plan as well and saw that as a parallel for him?
He may or may not have been aware of it. Of course, that was a number of years before. That would have preceded this by, what, 24 years or so.
Yeah.
And there were actually a number of, I'm aware of that Marie Antoinette saga. There were a number of other French sort of utopian settlements in the United States that preceded this. There's one up in the northeastern corner of Pennsylvania, and one in upstate New York, near what's now the town of Chaumont, or they call it Schmo in New York, but it's Chaumont. And Genet, Citizen Genet, who was the French ambassador to the United States during the French Revolution, he ended up purchasing property up there and stayed there. So there were a number of French settlements in the United States. So it was a very natural thing for them to think about this. And in point of fact, Marshal Ney fully intended to go to the United States after Waterloo. He had an invitation through the Pontalba family in New Orleans, who were in-laws of his, that were related to his wife's family, to come there. If you know, today the residence of the American ambassador in Paris is the Pontalba Palace in Paris. So there were a number of Napoleon would have been aware of a number of French colonies there, and quite possibly the Marie Antoinette abortive one that never did take place.
Thank you.
Another question, what long-term impact did the French emigre have on Philadelphia, and what was their role, if any, during the Civil War?
I'm sorry, the last part, the role in the
Yeah, what was the role and the impact that the French emigres had on the Philadelphia city, and what was their role during the Civil War?
Well, they had a big impact on Philadelphia. There were a lot of people who spoke French there. There already were, of course, from the Dominican refugees, and I would say that the Bonapartist refugees were a very colorful cast of characters who sort of set the style in Philadelphia and the fashions. And now a lot of them did not stay there forever. Grouchy is a good example. He stayed there for 4 or 5 years, purchased a house on Washington Square, as did Joseph Bonaparte, but eventually went back to France. Most of them did go back to France in 1830 when they were pardoned, or if not before, although some died here. Some of them married Americans, like Henri Lallemand, Charles Lallemand's younger brother, also a cavalry general, married Stephen Girard's niece. Napoleon's second cousin, Pascal Luciani, married a prominent Philadelphia woman and became a very successful businessman in Philadelphia, and developed the first trolley line in Philadelphia. It was a steam traction line for public transportation. So it was a mixed result depending on the persons, but they certainly did have at the time quite an impact on life in Philadelphia. You read in the book about the dinners they'd have and the dances and the gatherings, which were very well attended and actually much sought after by the Americans. The Americans liked them. They found them interesting, and as long as they well, I mean, Joseph Bonaparte's a great example. As I said, they called him the good Mr. Bonaparte, and he treated his neighbors very well. When he'd hire people, he'd pay them in gold. Maybe that's where the gold went. And he, in fact, was moving, and they hired some people to help move his furniture, and he came out the front door and said, "No, I'm an American. I'm going to help move myself." And so he worked along with the workmen. And I think it was very much that kind of relationship that these people had with the Americans. They were very popular here. At the citizen level, the U.S. government at the top level was very nervous about them being here. As you'll see in the book, people like Monroe and Madison and John Quincy Adams were very nervous about them being here.
That's a good introduction to a question I'd like to ask. What do you think would have happened to Napoleon and and how he would have been received if he had made it to the US. I know that's pure,
Well,
but
that's a good question. I think he,
the book that he wouldn't have just quietly sat in Philadelphia like Joseph or in Bordentown, but that he would have been involved in things here.
yeah, I think that's probably right. He sort of deluded himself into thinking that he could just become a scholar and a savant, and he may have entertained that for about 6 months after he got here. I think that given the presence of all of his military leadership here, it would have been they would have been feeding off of each other, and he would have been sucked into one of these plots involving Mexico. I think it's very highly likely he would have. He would have also been under pretty close scrutiny by the US government to prevent exactly that from happening. So whether he would have succeeded or not, I don't know. It's totally speculative. But I do think he had essentially a sort of a transactional view of the United States. He wanted to come here, but he wasn't particularly, he didn't know America that well. He didn't speak English really at all. And I think that it really was more of a convenience, and he would have taken the first opportunity to try to spin it into some other adventure to regain a throne of some sort. It would be my guess.
Another question, how did the exiles communicate with Napoleon in Saint-Helene? How did they communicate?
Well, that's interesting. They did. His brother Joseph, as you see in the book, they had a secret code, and they would communicate with each other by letters. And there's one letter that's cited in there, and it reads something like, "She's happy in July, Delta," a Greek letter, and a few other things. And it's still undeciphered to this day. Nobody knows what it meant. But there was active communication, and there was also a very active effort by a lot of these emigres to devise ways to spring Napoleon from St. Helena, including a Jamaican submarine, which, needless to say, didn't work. But there were multiple plots to try to get him out, and some of them are mentioned in the book. So they were in touch with each other. And by the way, Napoleon was very jealous of Joseph for having the diamonds from Spain, the royal diamonds from Spain, because they were worth quite a lot of money. And he said he wished he had them himself.
Thank you. I think we have time for some more questions if people have any. I see one in the chat. Are any of these immigrants' descendants prominent at this time, like modern time? You mentioned the tramway in Philadelphia. Are they
what permanent?
Are the descendants, the children of all these people, the ones who stayed in the United States, are any of them?
Oh, do they have descendants here now?
Yeah. What happened to them?
Well, most of them left their families behind in Europe, and their wives did not accompany them here because they were really, they were under death threats and they were desperate to escape. As I mentioned, Joseph Bonaparte did have a mistress, Annette Savage, and there are living descendants in the United States today. There's actually a fellow who's about my age, it looks just like Napoleon. Napoleon's second cousin, I believe, does have descendants living in the United States today, but most of them did not. So that's the short answer. Again, most of them eventually went back to France, where they rejoined their families by around 1830. So there are a few, but not many had living descendants here.
Another question. During his 1824 visit, did Lafayette keep his distance from Joseph Bonaparte and his circle?
No. He called on him. He went to Point Breeze and called on him, and they spent the day together. And that was actually it sort of broke the ice, I think, for the American government, because eventually the US President Monroe did meet with him, despite his initial concern and hesitancy to do so. But the answer is yes, Lafayette did. Any others?
In today's Demopolis in Alabama, the place is Demopolis by the Wine and Olive Society.
Yes, that is it. There is a town there on the site of it, and that isn't exactly the same. That is the same place. Unlike the Champ d'Azil, where they don't know where it is, they do know where Olive and Vine was.
Oh, that's good. I have another question about the art. How did Joseph Bonaparte art collection got to America?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, he fled aboard an American ship from the coast of France. He was rowed out into the ship. He didn't have his art collection with him at the time. And he did have jewels, though, which were more portable. And my guess is that he sold those jewels. Not a guess, because I've seen some of the sales orders given to his bankers. He sold those jewels and amassed his art collection after he was here in Europe, because there was no art market here in the United States at the time. I mean, this was revolutionary for the United States. So he was a very sophisticated and discerning collector, and he assembled that collection. When he died in the 1840s, it was auctioned off. And in fact, the catalog for the auction still exists, and was apparently the first auction catalog ever printed in the United States. And it gives, of course, a very detailed listing of exactly what paintings he had. I tried to trace a few of those just to see what might have happened to them. And most of them I could not trace. They disappeared. So they were probably sold, went back to Europe, and then were lost in various wars. I did find one in a museum, I believe in Germany, but most of them, I don't know where they are.
Okay, another question in the chat. Does Davidson College in North Carolina still use the seal and motto devised by Peter Ney?
They do indeed. Yes, and they have a collection of his personal effects there, including the flute that he played, as well as a compass that he used when he was in the military, whatever military he might have been in. So there, and they have some of his drawing. They have a lot of his drawings and a lot of his books. Also, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill has quite a collection of material on Peter Stewart Ney as well. Yes, that is still the official seal of Davidson College that he designed. He was an interesting fellow.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Tom.
Yeah, John.
It reads beautifully, and you've done a great deal of work. I'm just curious, how long did this effort take you, and how far did you travel to gather your sources?
Well, I actually wrote this book while I was researching it, which is not something I recommend because you're constantly having to revise what you've just written when you find something different. But I was working, I really did this in a blitz. I started it it basically took me about 4 years, I think between 3 and 4 years. In terms of the sources, they were all over the place. I got a lot of material. For example, the U.S. diplomatic dispatches from that time were at the National Archives here. Various people's diaries were at the Library of Congress. I did a lot of research at the Pennsylvania Historical Society in Philadelphia. And the thrill of actually holding letters, original letters written by Napoleon and Josephine and Marshal Ney in your hands is something I can hardly describe. It really is. It's just it's a thrill. Also researched in New York. There's some holdings at Columbia University and at the New York City Public Library. And obviously I had access to the French National Archives. A lot of the material, as you get into the footnotes in the book, you'll see a lot of it is was in French, and I translated it into English. Had not been published before in English or otherwise, a lot of it. So there's a lot of heavy archival research involved in this, and it was just all over the place, but it was a lot of fun to do.
Well, thank you so much. That was a very fascinating presentation, and it's absolutely a very good example of the long-lasting history and bonds between our two countries. So
Indeed.
again, I would love to thank you again on behalf of the Alliance Française Network in the USA, the Federation of Alliance Française USA, and of course, the Cultural Services of the French Embassy for this fantastic presentation. And I hope that we will be on to the next chapter and the next book on this fascinating topic.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure, and thank you for hosting me. I enjoyed it very much. Have a good evening.